Hello, everyone. This is a short recording about The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. We are going to go through 3 different discussion questions and kind of look at the different perspectives and way to read a story and analyze a story and start to take it apart for a deeper meaning. So as we get started, it is going to be really important that you've read the story first. So if you haven't read the story, press pause. Pull it up in Blackboard, read through the PDF, and that way as you watch the rest of this discussion, it makes a little more sense because you understand the plot and what all is going on. Our first question we're looking at is, what view of marriage does the story present? Does it only represent attitudes towards marriage in the 19th century, or could it equally apply to attitudes about marriages today? So does anybody want to start it off? What are your thoughts about marriage in The Story of an Hour? Go ahead.
I'd like to start. After reading the story, I've read it a couple of times because, I always miss things the first read through. And going through this, I don't have numbers for the paragraphs, but there are 2 paragraphs that really speak to the attitude of marriage. And I am looking for them right now. I found them, and then of course I've lost them. Okay. She said, there would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. So those 2 sentences speak to me when I'm thinking about marriage, especially during this time period. There is a will imposed in marriage. Both the man and the woman impose their wills upon each other, especially in marriage. This happens today too. But this notion of being free, this notion of having a free will, is definitely more present in this story during this time period. It was published 1894?
Yes.
Okay, and this is 6 years away from women being able to own their own property or have a job. So they were pretty reliant upon their spouse. And the expectation of being married and keeping the home was still very much present. So as much as we don't really see that domestic sphere as present in this story, I think that the attitude of marriage is, oh my gosh, I'm going to have freedom. I get to have this house because my husband has died. Like, I get to do what I want to do without having to answer to anybody else. But there is, in the very next paragraph, this notion of, why today we get married in the first place. It says, and yet she had loved him sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? But she says, she loved him, right? And sometimes she didn't. And I think that when you're married for a long time, you have this well, when you first marry, it's this notion of being in love and having that love. And it's interesting that there was love there at all, because I think too during this time period, marrying for love happened more often, but it still wasn't this concept that we know of now. Does that make sense? You married for stability. You married because that was societal expectation, and to keep the family name going. But there was love there, and sometimes there wasn't, and that's a reality in marriage today. So it's interesting in this story to see that that notion of love in marriage existed. So, I guess I'm all over the place, but I think you have to have the idea of marriage in your mind while you read through these passages more than once to kind of understand that she is excited about being free. She is excited about being her own person, which women weren't supposed to be during this time. But she admits that she loved her husband, which is a very today sort of thing to say, um, ahead of its time, if you will, in this story. When she says, "Believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature," they're both imposing their wills upon each other. There's a sort of equality there. Whereas again, during this time, we talk an awful lot about oppression of women, especially in a marriage. The man has the upper hand, and she kind of comments on that too by saying she's free. But she also kind of confesses that there's an equality in imposing a will on her husband, her will on her husband, and her husband imposing his will upon her. So, as much as she finds a freedom, I don't think she finds herself without fault in a marriage, and I don't think she finds herself without love for her marriage. I guess that's my response.
It sounds to me like I'm hearing you say, even though she craved the freedom, she still had a loving marriage. I disagree, because I think that's something a lot of people, as they read it, there's some battle there. Is it a quote unquote good marriage, or is it a bad marriage that they are just sticking through because they have to?
Well, if you get to the end of the story, I think she kind of.
I just realized my microphone was off.
Oh no, Sean. I think we see, her hopes of being an independent woman, when this wasn't commonplace during this time period. I mean, as a society, we're pushing toward it, but it's not commonplace. And she's excited at the chance of not having to answer to anybody but herself. So in that sense, I think she doesn't want to be married, but I don't think you can say that she didn't love her husband. That there were periods of of a happy marriage, but this notion of women's independence is obvious in this story as she faints and finds out her husband's still living at the end.
What I love is her name itself, and the name Louise I looked up means warrior, a fighter, somebody who is striving to change things. And mallard is a bird that doesn't fly very well. And so, of course, for most of the story, she's called Mrs. Mallard rather than her own name. She is attached to her husband. She's identified by her husband as someone who could fly but cannot fly very well. And of course, it's only after she says she's free that she becomes Louise, the warrior, the fighter.
Cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, the view of marriage seems to be, kind of piggybacking on what Allison was saying, it seems to be one of like a battle of the wills and compromise, and almost like an obligation, right? and
Right.
something that tends to box people in. You know, I'm not sure about the 19th century. I mean, yeah. Do you see a lot of patriarchy in here, or is it more of just two people, one person being unhappy? I was, reading back through it, I always kind of read it as a feminist style text, and I think it's been
Mhm.
touted as that, but um, I don't know. I mean, it seems like marriage is just being presented as something that prevents you from getting what you really want, right? And maybe since it's from her point of view, it's presenting her just as, well, I don't want this. We don't know what the guy feels, right?
I think that's pretty interesting because you don't see his reaction to her passing away. And so when you said something about the marriage almost looking like an obligation, you almost see it from both sides with the fact that they don't include his reaction to her falling and passing away. They talk about Richard, they talk about her sister at the end. And it does seem like I believe that they had a marriage with love in it. But I think sometimes you can lose yourself within a relationship, and the way she's able to capture that is pretty cool because it is happening then, but you see it happen now, and you hear people talk about we just fell out of love, but we'll always respect each other, and it almost seems like that's the picture she's painting with the story.
Yeah, it seems to be saying that all men and women restrict each other's freedoms, even lovingly. The bird in the golden cage, and but at the time period, as Sean was saying, thinking of independence for women particularly would have been like a forbidden pleasure. And it strikes me that the author, Chopin, writing at that time, must have been familiar with the Transcendentalists. In fact, I think in one of her other stories, I think it's The Awakening, she even has one of the characters reading some Emerson or Thoreau or one of the Transcendentalists, and that whole desire to march to the beat of your own drummer and to be independent, and that desire for self-determination and freedom must have been very strong in her coming out of that tradition.
That's interesting because of the passage that says when she looks out the window, she sees all these natural things.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's a beautiful transition to our next question.
Can I say one thing? Okay.
Absolutely.
There is one line, and it speaks to what you're saying. It says free, body and soul free.
Yeah.
And so that speaks to the Transcendentalists, this notion of freeing your soul and finding that freedom beyond what anybody else thinks. However, it says she kept whispering. She didn't shout it, she whispered it.
Good point.
Yeah.
Right? Still got to keep it on the down low.
It's such an intimate thing to whisper it, kind of like it's holy, to talk about your body, your soul. To me, it's very, I don't know.
It's intimate, but it's also still a secret.
Yeah, very true. Our second question, what is the significance of the ending of the short story? Did I skip one? Let's move over to this one because I think this is what we were really talking about. Choose one word from the passage below that you feel represents Miss Mallard. Analyze the layered meaning of the one word to show how it helps reveal the theme of the story. So who wants to go first and pick a word?
You still there, Mallory?
Oh. Go ahead, Allison.
No. I clicked the button.
Well, looking at this passage, do you mind if I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was having a hard time finding one word, but I was seeing a lot of related words. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to kind of connect them.
We'll let you bend the rules a little bit.
Well, just like there's a lot of potential, like the hope in a lot of this passage. So you have open, a quiver, spring, delicious, um, singing, twittering, right? So these are really provocative words, and they're pretty sensual words. So it really shows a potential. All these words together really show the potential of what's to come. What she's hoping for, right? And if you look, you've got all the senses there. You've got taste, right? Well, a lot of them anyway. You can hear, you can taste, a sense of space, a sense of touch, like the idea of a quiver and all that. So I think that helps kind of get at the underlying emotion that's emerging in her, or that's been dormant in her for so long.
Mm-hmm. I also like the word sparrow for Miss Mallard.
Yeah, right.
To me, I thought it was really cool. I had to look it up to know exactly what all they say about sparrows, but they're a common bird to be found out in the wild, which to me is what the story is about. She's ready to kind of fly the coop and be free and explore the world. But they also talk about how a lot of people use them as house pets. So you have that idea of being caged up and being expected to entertain others when all you really want is to fly out the window and experience life.
Oh, that's great. So it contains both the freedom and the repression within the one word.
Yeah. So
you mentioned freedom and repression, and there are juxtapositions of words in here: crying and singing, new spring life with distant song. So it sounds like she's seeing it on the horizon, but she's not quite there yet. And so there's still sort of this waiting that's happening.
That's great.
She could see. She is not seeing presently, right?
Yes.
It was there, but it was not within her grasp yet.
I looked at. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dorothy.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, along those same lines, Allison, there were 3 words, well, actually 4, that kind of got my attention. One was rain, because it seemed as if it could contain sadness, like tears, but could also be indicative of new life, of new growth, of bringing life into things. So I like that, the combination of possibilities there. And window, the last word of the passage, and of course being able to see from the one world where she is kind of contained within the comfort of the easy chair, and she has that old life where she's been taken care of and she's comfortable and loved but not free, and she can see out the window to the world beckoning to her. And then west, the clouds piling one another in the west, and of course west being frequently symbolic of death, because the sun going down in the west, kind of foreshadowing events to come. So I liked all of those, but then I just kind of picked one at random just to see what I could find out, and it was the word square. The beginning of the passage is, she could see in the open square before her house. And so I just started looking up meanings of the word square just to see if any of them would resonate with the kind of meaning of the story. And so here are some of the things I found out. In a sense, the word square is an oxymoron, because it's enclosed like a square, but the passage says it's an open square, so kind of conveying the restricted by society, bound in, but still open in terms of her ideas and desires for freedom. This is probably a push, but a square, a person who is boring and conventional, maybe as she herself has been, Mrs. Mallard. But a square mathematically is a number multiplied by itself, so it becomes many times its original self. It contains larger possibilities within itself. So both boring and conventional, but also having many possibilities. And then square meaning fairness, as in fair and square, to be in a situation in which everything is equal and no one has an advantage over anyone else, as she would hope a marriage would be. Gosh, there were lots of other meanings, but just a couple more. One is a square, as it's probably meant in this passage, being a small area of open land in a city or a town, often in the shape of a square, meaning freedom and nature surrounded by confinement. And so it just struck me, whether or not the author intended all of those meanings, and I'm sure she probably didn't, it doesn't really matter, but the multiple layers of meaning in the word kind of inform our understanding of the passage, like ripples from a rock thrown into a pond, and all of those meanings layered as we read the passage.
Yeah, on the I think also like the square is like the traditional, like the center of town, the place where people come to meet and exchange ideas.
Yeah.
So it also kind of represents that idea of potential of getting out and finding new things.
Perfect. Yeah.
Well, speaking of multiple meanings, our last question asks, what's the significance of the ending of the short story, and discuss the irony of the joy that kills? Any thoughts about the ending? Did you love it? Did you hate it?
Did we lose Mallory?
I think we did. I think the internet took her.
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, this is kind of like her joy was so strong that the loss of it killed her. It was kind of like losing all the oxygen suddenly when the window blows out of the plane. You know, I know that's a bad thing, but I guess that's all I have for the moment.
I'd say that I mean, there's sort of, again, that sort of juxtaposition of words, joy and kill, except kill is much stronger than joy, right? Like, they oppose one another, but kill is, I think, a much harsher word than joy. You know, when you think about the level of happiness that would have to match the word joy in its opposition, maybe exuberance or jubilation or something like that. But joy just seems small, and kill seems huge. So not quite sure what to do with that yet. But I know that, you know, when we think about the joy that kills, maybe it's saying that she experienced a small moment of joy, but that so quickly got smothered in such a large way.
I think my question is, what joy is it? Was it the joy of her husband actually walking through the door that killed her? Or is it the joy of freedom and that loss, that heartbreak, that heart aching that killed her?
I'm gonna say
Joy is what I'm talking about.
I'm gonna go back to that passage where that very one line, free, body and soul free, exclamation mark. She kept whispering, like that the whole story takes the time to look at how happy she is to have a taste of that freedom. And when she finds out that she doesn't have it, there may be a sort of relief that, you know, her husband isn't dead, but there's a bigger presence there of not having that freedom. So I think ultimately it's her realization that she doesn't have that freedom that kills her.
Yeah, and I think that's the dramatic irony of, like, it represents society's ignorance to her situation. You know, the fact that she doesn't like the marriage, you know, doesn't want to be cooped up, but nobody else can see that, right? So they're just like, oh, she was so happy she died, right? Because he, you know, came back.
It's interesting that
You know
the
what I mean?
people who say that are the doctors who would have been male. So the male doctors said she died of joy. of joy that killed, when we know that probably it wasn't the joy that killed her, but the loss of her freedom. Although I did read one critique, maybe she did die of joy, but her joy wasn't from the good news that her husband is still alive, but it's kind of from her own death, in which she acquires some kind of immortal freedom and flies away as an angel or something.
Well, Dorothy, to kind
I mean, I think
of
very much. Oh, sorry.
with Sean and with Dorothy, what you're saying, notice in those latter passages, especially the one that I pointed to earlier, where she says, and yet she had, where the narrator said, and yet she had loved him sometimes. It starts there in that paragraph, but then it starts to untangle itself, and it says, often she had not. That comes later. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, blah blah blah, suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse, the possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being. Self-assertion, free, that strength. That's how we end that paragraph, not still reminiscing of the love she has for her husband. And I think we see that pattern in the paragraphs that follow. We start weak and we end strong and we end independent.
I agree. I think that it was the loss of the freedom that caused her death. I love that they include that the doctor claimed it was the joy that killed. And it goes back into that gender role of her job was to love her husband. So, of course, this fragile woman couldn't handle him walking back in. She was overcome by joy. That's what killed her. It seems to constantly make the female look like she's just this fragile person, which I think is the irony of it all. Is Chopin's trying to kind of, I'm woman, hear me roar, we are strong, we can handle things, and challenge that idea that you have to have a man, that you have to be submissive. But a lot of people can quickly read over the end of the story and just think, oh. And so that to me is what's really interesting about the end.
Yeah, and if you like pair this up with the yellow wallpaper and look at the control and all that and what drove the woman insane and that, it's the same situation.
And the same question arises at the end. Does she find freedom? At the end of the story, for Gilman, it's the character ends up really kind of losing it, but does she find freedom in that mental instability?
Her soul finds freedom, if not her body.
And then for Louise Mallard, does she find that freedom in death? Right?
Very interesting. I think we've got about a minute left. So closing remarks, any thoughts?
I really loved I love the analysis of etymology, the meaning of names. That was very telling and clever. But again, even Chopin seemed to structure her story as heading in as what you would perceive the woman to be, and at the end of a paragraph, it's what women should have been. The structure, weak to strong, that's very, very clever, and I hadn't really noticed that before.
I like that, Allison. I also read a quote by Chopin, and I don't know if it was from one of her letters or from one of her other stories, but the quote was, "The bird that would soar above the level plane of tradition and prejudice must have strong wings." So I just thought that applied both to Mrs. Mallard and to what you were saying about weak to strong and weak to strong.
Absolutely.
And even her life, if students take the time to kind of look up a little bit about her life and what she was able to soar over, you can see very much that seems to be a theme that runs through everything she touched.
It's true.
Any other final thoughts?
I wish we could do this for another 30 minutes.
I know, that was wonderful. Let me switch on over and remind people who are still watching to think back on what you noticed about the story of an hour. We touched on this very quickly, but from our discussion, you can go back into the story and find many other avenues to search through, look through, think about times then versus times now. Also think about why it's important to look through a story beyond just the literal plot. What is it teaching you about life? What is it teaching you about life back then, life now, and is that still the same story and message? And then last, because we can't be together, think about how you can continue to participate in discussions this semester, even though we may not be able to meet face-to-face or meet in a live class with everything that we read. This was helpful, and we look forward to talking with you. Thank you very much.